There's never been a power like America in recorded history. That's not a slogan. It's not a campaign line. It's not a patriotic soundbite. It's a sentence from Stephen Kotkin, a historian who has spent his entire career studying how great powers collapse. Empires that looked eternal. Systems that believed they were stable right up until the moment they weren't. So when someone like that opens with a claim this blunt, especially in 2025, it should stop you cold. Because look around. The United States feels fractured. Politics looks chaotic. Debt is ballooning. Every news cycle tells you the same story in a different font. America is in decline. So when Kotkin says there has never been a power like this one, the question isn't whether he's being optimistic. The question is why he's so certain. And once you understand why he says that, you also understand what he thinks people are getting wrong about this moment. Kotkin doesn't start with leaders or elections. He starts with scale, with structure, with the kind of fundamentals that don't trend on social media but quietly determine how long systems survive. He points out something that sounds abstract until you sit with it. For nearly 150 years, the United States has produced roughly a quarter of global GDP. Across wars, depressions, cultural upheavals, political revolutions, and repeated predictions of collapse, America has roughly 25% of global GDP for almost 150 years, with only 5% of the global population. That combination is historically bizarre. Most empires surge and fade. They peak, overextend, and get replaced. What's unusual about the US isn't moral purity or flawless leadership. It's persistence. This is where the decline narrative usually kicks in. People point to debt servicing overtaking defense spending. They point to polarization, dysfunction, cultural exhaustion. Kotkin doesn't deny any of that. What he rejects is the assumption that policy chaos automatically equals imperial collapse. Administrations come and go. Tax regimes flip. Cultural moods swing hard in both directions. And yet, the underlying system keeps generating output, innovation, military capability, and global influence at a level no other country has matched across so many dimensions at once. That doesn't mean decline is impossible. It means decline doesn't work the way people think it does. To explain that, Kotkin reaches for the comparison everyone loves: Britain. The British Empire once dominated global trade, finance, and norms, but Kotkin argues that the analogy breaks down fast. Decline is rarely just about failure. It's about replacement. And this is where Kotkin becomes deeply uncomfortable for almost everyone. He doesn't see a replacement waiting today. Not in Europe. Not in Russia. Not even in China. That doesn't mean the US is safe. It means the situation is stranger. America isn't being overtaken by a superior system. It's being tested while still sitting at the center of global demand. Kotkin tells a story he hears constantly when he travels. Europeans criticize Americans as chaotic, crude, even barbaric. And then, almost immediately, they beg the United States not to leave. Security guarantees. Trade stability. Crisis response. The demand for American power hasn't declined. It's intensified. Which creates the paradox of this moment. If American power is still structurally massive, why does everything feel so fragile? Why does politics feel like theater instead of governance? Why does attention seem to matter more than competence? Kotkin's answer isn't flattering, and it isn't partisan. It's about what happens when spectacle begins to replace performance. And to explain that, he reaches for a metaphor that sounds ridiculous until you realize how precise it is. He compares modern American politics to professional wrestling. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Kotkin describes it with unsettling precision. They wear great costumes, they have face paint, great nicknames, and the audience is mesmerized. That word matters. Mesmerized. Because a mesmerized audience isn't evaluating competence. It isn't asking whether anything durable is being built. It's reacting. And Kotkin's concern isn't that politics has become theatrical. Politics has always had performance. The danger is that performance itself has become the governing model. In this version of politics, disruption feels like action. Breaking things feels like progress. But governments don't run on attention. They run on institutions, coordination, budgets, and follow through. And this is where Kotkin's tone shifts from analytical to uneasy. Because beneath the spectacle, the machinery of governance is quietly deteriorating. He keeps returning to a simple question that cuts through the noise: who is actually running the government? Not who dominates the news cycle. Not who controls social media. Who writes the budget? When was the last time the United States passed a real one? The country now stumbles from deadline to deadline, relying on temporary fixes while pretending this is normal. The wrestling continues. The crowd stays engaged, but the system underneath is running on fumes. Kotkin has studied revolutions long enough to know that breaking systems is easy. Destruction feels decisive. It creates the illusion of control. The hard part is what comes next. Rebuilding doesn't happen with clean tools. It happens with whatever fragments are left behind. And history shows that revolutions rarely create something genuinely new. More often, they reproduce the old system under a different label, with fewer constraints and worse outcomes. This is where Kotkin frustrates both sides of the American debate. He understands the anger at bloated bureaucracy. He understands the resentment toward ideological capture inside institutions that are supposed to project American power. He even understands why agencies like USAID become symbolic targets. But he's blunt about what that kind of targeting accomplishes. It doesn't fix the real problem. It burns political capital on small, visible enemies, while leaving the largest forces untouched. He uses a stark analogy. If an army comes over the hill, and that army is made up of Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and long-term entitlement obligations, that's why Kotkin draws a sharp line that cuts across ideology. I'm not interested in smaller government. I'm interested in better government. Smaller can be reckless. Smaller can be incompetent. Smaller can be performative. Better is harder. Better requires prioritization, expertise, institutional memory, and political courage. And that is fundamentally incompatible with wrestling politics, which thrives on constant motion and perpetual conflict. Kotkin also challenges the idea of mandate. Winning an election with less than half the electorate does not authorize a revolution. It authorizes governance. Historically, transformational change has required broad coalitions, not narrow victories amplified by media ecosystems. When leaders confuse attention with consensus, they overreach. And when they overreach, they weaken the very institutions they need to govern effectively. What worries Kotkin most isn't chaos. America has survived chaos before. What worries him is the normalization of incompetence. The belief that as long as the show continues, the system will somehow hold. That assumption works until it doesn't, until something breaks that actually matters. And when that moment arrives, spectacle won't fix it, and the world won't wait for the bell to ring. This is usually the moment when the conversation turns to China, and Kotkin doesn't avoid that shift, but he approaches it in a way that cuts against most of the usual commentary. He acknowledges that the United States is being tested across multiple fronts at once, through cyber intrusions, supply chain leverage, influence campaigns, and grey zone pressure. But Kotkin insists that focusing only on China's external reach misses something far more important about how power actually functions inside a system. Kotkin points to the endless anti-corruption purges as evidence, not of strength, but of anxiety, because they haven't slowed over time, they've intensified, and in systems like this that has consequences. Kotkin has studied communist regimes long enough to recognize the trap when he sees it. There is no stable middle ground, where a ruling party can open up just enough to gain flexibility without threatening its own survival. Open the system too much, and people begin asking why there shouldn't be another party. clamp down too hard, an initiative disappears altogether. Every communist system eventually confronts this dilemma, and China is no exception. That doesn't make it weak in the short term, but it does make it brittle over time, especially when decisive action is required. This brittleness matters because so much discussion treats China's rise as inevitable, as if history moves in straight lines. Kotkin rejects that framing. Systems governed by fear often hesitate at the moment. Real risk is required, preferring testing and probing to commitments that could trigger unintended consequences. They bluff, they pressure, and they push at the edges, but decisive moves carry the danger that the system itself could crack under strain, and that fear quietly shapes behavior in ways outsiders tend to underestimate. Which brings the focus back to the United States. If the threat is not a superior, confident external model waiting to replace American power, then the most serious danger lies inside the system itself. For Kotkin, the danger is governance, not ideology, not culture wars, but the functioning of institutions, especially Congress. Article I was designed to legislate, budget and restrain executive power, forming the backbone of democratic accountability, yet in practice it has increasingly failed to perform that role. And when Congress stops functioning effectively, power doesn't disappear, it flows elsewhere, usually toward the executive, not because of a conspiracy, but because someone still has to make decisions. This is how executive authority expands by default, as one party warns about overreach when it's out of power and then embraces it when it's in, gradually eroding limits and stacking precedents that weaken the system's ability to correct itself. Kotkin's warning here is historical rather than partisan. Concentrated power often feels efficient in the moment, especially when you trust the person wielding it. But history is full of examples where that enthusiasm turns into regret once the next leader arrives. Kotkin doesn't pretend the American past was calm or orderly. The country has always been turbulent, often violent, and frequently irrational. What makes the current moment different is the prolonged failure of institutions designed to manage that turbulence. Elections are supposed to produce accountability and correction, yet instead they've produced razor-thin margins, chronic gridlock, and repeated attempts at transformation without the broad consensus required to sustain it. Still, Kotkin refuses to predict collapse. He points to moments that looked far worse, especially the 1970s, when Watergate shattered trust, Vietnam ended in defeat, inflation spiraled, industrial regions collapsed, and American soft power evaporated, and yet the system adapted, not because leaders were exceptional, but because the structure allowed correction. That capacity to rebound is why he argues American power is extraordinarily hard to destroy, leaving the open question of whether that resilience can outlast sustained institutional failure. Because history suggests empires rarely fall from external pressure alone, but from the slow erosion of the systems meant to govern power from within. All of this brings us back to the paradox Stephen Kotkin keeps circling without ever turning it into a slogan. American power, in his view, is unusually hard to destroy. It has survived disastrous policies, humiliating defeats, cultural breakdowns, and long stretches of political dysfunction, not because it is morally superior or perfectly led, but because its underlying structure has absorbed shocks that would have shattered most systems. Kotkin puts it plainly when he reminds us that American power is very hard to wreck because we try all the time and it's still there. That observation isn't patriotic optimism, it's historical diagnosis. But resilience is not immunity. The danger is not sudden collapse. It is slow erosion, hidden by the fact that the system keeps functioning just well enough to delay accountability. This is why Kotkin is skeptical of the idea that breaking institutions is a shortcut to fixing them. He understands the frustration that fuels that instinct. When systems feel bloated, unresponsive, or captured by ideology, demolition feels like clarity. But history offers a cruel lesson here. When institutions are broken, they don't get rebuilt under ideal conditions. What Kotkin keeps returning to is competence, not as a buzzword, but as a governing principle. Not ideological alignment, not cultural signalling. Competence. The ability of a government to do the unglamorous things reliably, the things no private actor can fully replace. Infrastructure, public health, safety standards, crisis response. These systems rarely attract attention when they work, but they define stability when they fail. And when politics becomes permanently performative, competence becomes invisible until it's gone. Kotkin also pushes back against the belief that elections alone can fix this. Elections matter, but they do not automatically produce good governance, especially in a system defined by narrow margins and constant polarization. Instead, they can produce cycles of overreach and backlash, where each side attempts transformational change without the consensus required to sustain it, gradually exhausting the institutions meant to absorb political conflict. Still, Kotkin refuses to predict collapse. He reminds us that American history is filled with moments that looked terminal. The 1970s were not just unstable, they were demoralizing, marked by Watergate, Vietnam, inflation, industrial collapse, a near total loss of confidence. And yet the system recalibrated, not because leaders were exceptional, but because enough institutional capacity remained intact to allow correction. That window, Kotkin suggests, still exists, but it is not guaranteed. And this is where his message sharpens into a final warning, one that defines the entire conversation. The key variable, he says, is governance, not spectacle, not attention, not even power itself. Governance. Because history doesn't punish empires for being challenged. It punishes them for assuming they can afford incompetence. Shows can run for a long time, audiences can stay entertained, but eventually reality enters the picture, and when it does, the only thing that matters is whether the institutions behind the spectacle are capable of doing their job. That's the bet Kotkin is quietly asking us to confront. Not on a leader, not on a party, but on whether the system that made American power possible can still govern it wisely. Because if it can, the story of decline will once again turn out to be premature. And if it can't, no amount of performance will be enough to stop what comes next.